So in 1915, in order to get the war going, they had to propagandize, and they had to have control of the newspapers in order to create the mood for war. But just the hate that they were spreading was not sufficient. Congress was still not ready to declare war because Congress knew these people were not our enemies. So how did it come about? If you look in your history books, you'll find that Edward Mandell House, if you look him up, you'll find that he was sent to Europe just prior to World War I on a peacemaking mission. Oh no, it wasn't a peacemaking mission at all. It was a war-making mission. Edward Mandell House was sent to Europe to find out what it would take to get the United States in the war. And he discussed something with Winston Churchill, who happened to be head of the British Navy during World War I. And they agreed that the thing that would bring the United States into a war it would be if a passenger ship were sunk with Americans on board. That's what they agreed on. That's what they decided on. Within 2 months of the time that Edward Mandell House was there, the Lusitania had left New York, crossed the Atlantic safely until just before reaching England. And at that point, it was ordered into an area where a German U-boat was known to be waiting. And with her escorts withdrawn. During the war, they traveled with warship escorts on each side of these passengers, especially something like the Lusitania. And it was sent in at drastically reduced speed. The German U-boat was there. It was a sitting duck. No escorts, no military backup, moving at a very slow speed so the torpedo could not miss. And within months after that, of course, the United States did get into the war. So it was not just the propaganda, but it was that incident that convinced the American people that they needed to be in the war, and the United States Congress did declare war. And we got into the most worthless, most nonsense, most unnecessary war ever in the history of the United States. Absolutely no reason to be there. But the munitions industry was cranked up, and the powder industry, and the steel, and the shipbuilding, and the railroads, full steam with these guys running it, plus loaning the government the money for the war. That is the true story behind World War I. The rest of the story comes at the end of the war. Good old Edward Mandell House, a very busy guy. He wrote the Treaty at Versailles. He wrote the Treaty of the League of Nations for Mr. Wilson, for President Wilson. He represented the United States there. In fact, Wilson went with him to France, to Versailles, to get the other nations to sign this treaty. Well, we're very fortunate. The United States did not sign it, as you know. We did not join the League of Nations for the very simple reason that the League of Nations required a military, an international military force greater than any other individual national military force. And the United States Senate, which ratifies our treaties, took one look at that and they said, well, this is stupid. If we, so if we sign this, it'll be a threat to the security of the United States. We'll be the target. They didn't have any trouble figuring that out. So we did not sign it. But I said bring Jacob Schiff back here for a minute. During the war, during World War I, Jacob Schiff gave to the Bolshevik Revolution $20 million. This is a matter of record. This is on record. This can be documented. So here we are fighting over in France and fighting the Germans and the Axis forces there. And Schiff and these guys are already creating for themselves a closed nation. They're building them for themselves the communist nation. There's a book on that. It was called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, written by a very competent researcher from Stanford who Actually, he was an economist, and they asked him to study and figure that out, and he came up with that. Discovered also the Soviet Union was totally financed from the United States. So not just our friends were in England were financed, but they also financed our enemies. That's where the big money was, and that's where the big power was. Why would they be interested in the League of Nations? Why did they send House to do the League of Nations? That would be their key to global control. We can run the whole world, financially and politically, economically and politically, if we have a global government, a global force, more powerful than any other force on the earth. And that was their objective. They lost. They did not accomplish that. Woodrow Wilson died. And Edward Mandell House went to New York and established an organization called the Council on Foreign Relations. After he got that set up, he went over to England and set up their counterpart of the Council on Foreign Relations called the Royal Institute of International Affairs. So we had in England insiders gathering together to take over the world. In the United States, insiders gathering together to take over the world. That was their objective. They made no bones about it. The Council on Foreign Relations gave them an opportunity to pose as a dignified organization, that they were going to tell the world what their plans are, and they're going to convert everybody to the idea that we're better off without nationhood. And so that's where it began. That's where officially the organization began, the Council on Foreign Relations. Until about 10 years ago, you could read the annual reports of the Council on Foreign Relations. It listed Edward Mandell House as the founder. Well, they've removed that because House couldn't help bragging so much. He wrote 4 great big volumes about his ingenuity and everything, bragging about maneuvering all these things in the position. And so I guess that's why they've taken his name off. So Woodrow Wilson died, and after the war, I'll guarantee you, the American people were in no mood for any more war, no more internationalism, no more of this nonsense, these social welfare state programs that Woodrow Wilson had pushed through. None of that. They were through with it. And they wanted to get back to the Constitution. They want to get out of wars and intrigues and foreign entanglements. And so they elected Warren Harding. Warren Harding took the place of Woodrow Wilson. Warren Harding was a constitutionalist. He obeyed the Constitution. He phased out as many of the welfare state programs as he could and paid off the war debt. I shouldn't say him alone, with the help of Calvin Coolidge, because Harding died in office and Calvin Coolidge was the vice president. He took it over and then he won another re-election. So these two guys represented the presidency of the United States from 1920 to 1928. And during those 8 years, they paid off the national debt. They got us out of all foreign entanglements, canceled stupid treaties, refused, obviously, to sign the League of Nations or to join any kind of international intrigue. Were these guys happy with them? They were furious. They were so furious and have such power. You look these guys up today in Wikipedia or in any encyclopedia, or better yet, in a school book. The school book, the history book your children use at school. What does it say about these men? They were the worst presidents the United States ever had. They totally destroy the character of these men, even implying scandals and so forth. They didn't own 2 presidents. But after they got the Council on Foreign Relations set up, they went back into the president buying business. And that is where Herbert Hoover came from. Now you remember, he was sold to the public as a conservative, remember? Good old Hoover with the Hoover buttons. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And the names in red here, Stimson and Nelson and Meyer, these were the Mellon and Meyer, these were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. So from that time on, we had them in official positions. There's none here because these offices didn't exist at that time. Herbert Hoover was not a conservative. He was an internationalist. And he did everything he was told from headquarters, from these guys up here. I'll move this down so you can... They were the boss. They were the real president. After Hoover, you'll remember, came along FDR. FDR had some of the same people running him, Stettinius, Stimson, Morgenthau, and Black. Roosevelt was under the total domination of the CFR. Not a member himself. The first visitor he had when he took office, guess who? Guess who came to see him? Edward Mandell House. His first official visitor, and he stayed for a week. Roosevelt didn't see anybody else but him for a week, his first week in office. He showed him how to get us back into another war. This time we're going to do it right. This time we are going to consolidate all of our forces. We are going to have control over not just print media, but we now had radio. And you're going to have a nightly radio broadcast. And through radio, we will promote what we want. And through the office of the President of the United States. He was well groomed. He did exactly as he's told. Now, the amazing thing is, remember, Winston Churchill was head of the British Navy during World War I. Well, at the same time, Roosevelt was head of the U.S. Navy. He was a Secretary of Navy during that same period of time when the Lusitania was sunk. Now, he is head of state, and Winston Churchill is the Prime Minister. In August of 1941, the two men met out at sea in the Atlantic, and they drew up an agreement. It was known as the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter envisions the kind of world we're going to have at the end of World War II, at the end of the next World War. Here's the kind of government we're going to have, the kind of world we're going to have. We're going to have one military power that's stronger than all others. That was the one agreement of the Atlantic Charter. You can Google that, you can see that's exactly what it says. You can print that out. They met at sea and drew up an agreement before we were even in the war. Roosevelt promised him, he said, no matter what happens to me, I will bring the country into the war. He assured him. After that, he sent diplomats over to discuss the war, especially, of course, since England was already in the war, and England was dying for us to come into the war. Roosevelt was dying to get us into the war. From that time on, he and his aides did everything they could. Stimson and Harry L. Stimson and Stettinius, they did everything they could to provoke an attack by Japan between August and December of 1941. How did they do it? First of all, they cut off all Japanese assets in the United States. They closed their bank accounts, both official Japanese bank accounts and individuals from Japan. Then they closed all shipping through the Panama Canal to Japan. No Japanese ships going through the Panama Canal. They cut off all U.S. shipping with Japan. And they let our allies know that if they did any trade with Japan, that they would lose diplomatic recognition by the United States. So, what's Japan going to do? And I'm not saying they didn't have a plan. I'm not saying that they were lily white in this, because they were not. It was a brutal, terrible thing they did at Pearl Harbor. But Roosevelt provided the way for that to occur. And he provided even more than just those economic measures, sanctions against Japan. The next thing that occurred, interestingly, the United States had broken the code that Japan used to communicate with spies to their embassies. The United States received those on a daily basis. Japanese spies in Pearl Harbor were radioing Tokyo the exact location of our warships in Pearl Harbor. Those intercepts were received by the FBI. They were given directly to the President of the United States, obviously, and to his military aide at that time, who was George Catlin Marshall. They received the warnings. They knew the attack was coming. They knew where the attack would come. I'm not sure if they knew the exact date, but they probably did. And the attack came. It cost us 3,000 men on that day, and that day of infamy, as he calls it. And afterwards, Roosevelt had the audacity to go on radio with his Day of Infamy speech, and every other line in that speech was without warning, without warning, without warning. He knew. He knew. He was bringing us into the war that the insiders wanted, this time a huge war. So they succeeded. Now, very often when this story about Japan's attack is understood and told, some people say, well, it's a good thing we got in the war then, because otherwise we'd have to fight Hitler, and if Hitler, we might not have succeeded because we got in early enough to build up our military forces and our equipment. No, that's not true. We also financed Hitler. These guys were the #1 backers of Adolf Hitler prior to World War II. In the 1920s, when Hitler was marching around trying to gather up people into the Nazi Party, the Germans laughed at him. They didn't pay any attention to him. I was giving this last night at a meeting. There was a guy from Germany there. He said, it's exactly what happened. Hitler had no power at all until he got the big money. He got the big money from the insiders in the United States and from a company in Germany, which was known as IG Farben Company. Here's their offices at Frankfurt. This was the channel by which the money went to Hitler. It is the largest pharmaceutical cartel in the world, plus the largest chemical cartel in the world, and still is today, IG Farben. The Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Schiffs, the J.P. Morgans, that was their company along with German owners, and that was the channel by which Hitler was financed. Now take a good look at this picture, because this picture was taken right after after World War II. This picture was taken in Frankfurt, Germany, when the entire town was leveled, except this building. This building was not hit. This was out of bounds, off limits to U.S. bombers and the Allied bombers. They were not allowed to hit IG Farben. There was not so much as one broken window in that building, but the rest of Frankfurt was leveled. The schools, the churches, the homes, the office buildings, everything. When they run a war, they decide what the terms and policies of that war are going to be. Thank you. They determined that. And they did. It was their war. In the Nuremberg hearings, the people who ran IG Farben were there. They brought them in. They acquitted them. They got the military guys. They got the death camp people. But they didn't get Farben. They should have. Why should they have gotten Farben? Because Farben was making the poison gas that was used in the gas chambers. And they made the fuel that Hitler used for his U-2 rockets he was sending over to England near the end of the war. And they were in the process of developing the atomic bomb. So, but when you're in the war-making business, you're in the president-buying business, it leads to problems. And these are the problems we're talking about today. How we got into this mess. This is how we got into this mess, and it has continued because every president of the United States since that time has been dominated by the CFR. Here is Harry Truman. CFR members took over from after Roosevelt died as vice president and then got elected again. While he was president, he appointed Secretary of Navy, Secretary of the Defense, I should say. He had been a Navy officer, James Forstall. He was a Navy pilot in World War I. He was a pilot during World War II, and a war hero. He was also taken into the CFR. These guys took him in, their descendants, I should say, took him into the Council on Foreign Relations, and he made an interesting discovery. He discovered that members of the Council on Foreign Relations who were betraying the United States always used the excuse that they didn't know. Oh, we didn't know we didn't realize we're doing all that harm. That was a mistake. Oh, we misfigured that. And our policy wasn't right. We didn't know what we were doing. Stupidity. And he came up with a slogan. He said, consistency has never been a mark of stupidity, because they were consistently anti-American, consistently un-American, consistently working against the interests of the United States. Today, we have people talking about problems in the United States who never name the real problem. Good old Ike. Remember the I Like Ike's bumper stickers? He was an insider all along. Look at the CFR people dominate everything in red here, members of the Council on Foreign Relations, including I Like Ike. He was actually a Democrat a few months before he ran as a Republican, but people were tired of war. They never elect the warmongers or the socialists right after war. They try to get somebody in. He's a war hero, and he posed as a conservative, and his administration was devastating. As you probably know, he was followed by Kennedy. His administration also dominated, ran by the CFR. Lyndon Johnson, run by the CFR. Richard Nixon was a member of the CFR himself. Not necessarily a very loyal one. It was probably out of political expediency. He was a consummate politician. But he decided he was going to get rid of these guys, his CFR guys, and bring in some of his own friends. And like J. Gordon Liddy and Halderman and those guys that were involved in the Watergate thing. He was going to bring them in and get rid of these guys. What the public never really knew and never understood was that Nixon's presidency was under the control of these men who recorded every word he said through his entire administration. All right, we will give you the presidency, but you're going to have the right guys on the cabinet, and we will have a record of everything that takes place. You will be loyal to us. That's where the Watergate tapes came from. They were not made for school children. They were not made for history books. I'll guarantee you that. You listen to the Watergate tapes, they're full of foul language and everything else. But they framed him, they set him up. Kissinger and Alexander Haig, who had earlier been on his cabinet, planned this scheme for dumping him. They got some of his men to break into the Watergate, tell them there's some secrets here that we need, which was pure baloney. He didn't need any secrets at all from the Democratic Party, because he was in the polls. He was way ahead in the polls for the next election. He didn't need anything except just to not be involved in a scandal. So when he found out what had happened, those guys, he's, how could you be so stupid? He's swearing and cussing him and everything. But he decided, well, I either blow the whistle on you guys or I cover it up. Okay, he decided to cover it up. That's what they got him on the tapes for, is covering it up. Why didn't he destroy the tapes? He never had them. He never had control of the tapes for 1 minute. They were in the basement of the White House, run by the Signal Department, whom these guys put in there to keep the tapes, to keep the records. If he'd had them, he could have destroyed them. He never would have been impeached, or even anywhere near impeached. So Richard Nixon was Watergated. And he was Watergated by the guys who were going to be thrown out of his administration. We're running this, you're not running this, you're not the President of the United States, Mr. Nixon. You think you are, the American people think you are, but you are not the President of the United States. We are the President of the United States. we put you where we got you where you are, and you are going to abide by our counsel. Okay, next we have Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter started the energy shortage. Jimmy Carter, as you can see, was one of the boys from the very beginning. He goes campaigning around the country. You can elect me. He actually said in his campaign speeches, I am not an insider. I'm not one of the big boys. I'm just a tobacco farmer from Georgia, and if that's what you want, elect me for president. He campaigned that way, while all along